Nick also does not need an introduction. I've followed him twice, first to Calvin College and then to Yale. Both times it was perfectly clear to me that it's possible to follow Nick, but it's not possible to replace Nick. We've had the benefit of his presentation of Bill Alston's work. He is an excellent lecturer, and Nick has given us a number of asides and clarifications that Bill would not himself have given us. You may have noticed Nick's emphasis on the I in these lectures is not Nick Wolterstorff, but William Alston. This is partly because there is substantial disagreement between the two of them. For example, for Alston, one central problem is to start by identifying the appearance in perception, and then to provide some argument that there is an object that corresponds to that appearance. And Nick sees that problem quite differently. I think he's going to have an opportunity in the question and answer session to ask a question in his own voice. We will have the question and answer session about 5 minutes after the close of the lecture. One final word. The title of this third lecture is The Need for True Statements About God and How to Reconcile This with Divine Mystery. In the first lecture, we were introduced to the divine mystery thesis, roughly that no positive concepts in the human repertoire can be truly applied to God as God is in God's self. In the second lecture, this thesis was supported by reference primarily to mystical experience, especially that of Thomas Merton and Thomas Keating. In this third lecture, we're going to be given, as it were, the antithesis, the contradicting claim that we need true statements about God, and then we're going to be given the reconciliation between the two claims, the synthesis. Now, I have not read these lectures beforehand, but there is one thing I will be looking out for as this rabbit is drawn out of the hat. In the tradition, there is a familiar doctrine that what we can say truly about God in God's self is only by analogy. It is true nonetheless, but not true in the straightforward or familiar meaning of the words we use. But the nature of the relationship between these two meanings and the conditions for using the analogous terms to give us truth, this is usually left undefined. So this is what I'm hoping for. And I've asked a question about it in the question and answer period. I'm looking for some typical Alstonian clarity about the relation between the familiar meaning of the terms and their meaning as applied to God, so that we can say both that we do not have the concepts and that we do have them at the same time.
John, thank you on behalf of both of us, Bill Alston and myself. And that was an excellent introduction for what you yourselves should be looking for. Let me set what Alston is doing here in its own context. And this context is especially important to keep in mind given the generally Barthian ethos for the last 50 years or so of this divinity school. On the one hand, Christians talk all the time about God and take it that what they're saying about God is true, more or less, and so forth. But Alston wants to point to another part of the Christian tradition, the mystical contemplative tradition within Christianity. It's not just Buddhist and so forth, but a part of the Christian tradition, which says that a lot of the representatives say that none of our concepts apply to God, not even approximately. So this is Bill, friend of mine, and John. Bill's challenge is, can these two parts of the Christian tradition fit together in some way, or must the good Barthians say, forget about you contemplatives, or the good contemplatives say, forget about you Barthians, or is there some way of the two living together? And the divine mystery thesis, which comes out here, is, as John said, the thesis that none of our concepts, none of the positive concepts in the human conceptual repertoire apply truly to God. So the lecture begins like this. You have probably heard more than enough by now about the divine mystery thesis, what it is and what it isn't, and why it deserves to be taken seriously. We're now ready to move on to what is to be said for the other side of the contrast. Reasons for taking seriously the idea that some positive concepts can be applied to God as he is in himself, so as to make judgments that are strictly true. And then we'll have to find some way in which these two conflicting positions, or what can be saved of each of these two conflicting positions, can live harmoniously together. So we're ready in this final lecture for the antithesis and then for the synthesis. And the thesis, remember, is the divine mystery thesis. In presenting the case for the antithesis, I first admit that the most obvious reasons for Christians to insist that strictly true statements can be made about God do not conflict with the divine mystery thesis at all. Because remember that the denial of true statements about God in the divine mystery thesis is limited to those that concern God as God is in himself. But the most compelling reasons for insisting on strictly true statements about God have to do with God's relations with creatures. Consider, for example, God created the heavens and the earth. God exercises providence over his creatures. God has a master plan for the redemption and salvation of his human creatures. God makes both positive and negative requirements for his human creatures. God promises an eternal life of loving communion with him and their fellow creatures to those who have faith in him and follow in his way. I could continue the list at length, says Alston, but you get the idea. The divine mystery thesis is not at all but you get the idea. Now, by way of contrast, that those statements are about God as God relates to creation, not as God is in himself. Now, by way of contrast, consider the following statements that are about God as he is in himself. And here Alston cites Anselm's famous, God is that than which nothing greater, more excellent, more perfect can be conceived. And this gets spelled out by Anselm himself in terms of God's goodness, that God is good, God's power, God's knowledge, God's love, God's providential care, God's blessedness or felicity, God's glory, and so forth. All about God. Many mainline Christians and devotees of other theistic religions will resist the suggestion that such statements as those are not strictly true. Of course, any such attributions as we can make are necessarily very sketchy, lacking in detail. How could it be otherwise? But that doesn't prove that they're not true. To take a humble analogy, I don't have to know how grass manufactures what makes it green in the spring to say truly that grass does in fact become green in the spring. Now, one may think that these perfections are aspects of God and his relations to creatures rather than of God as he is in himself. Because you ask, how can God be compassionate or providential, two items on our list, coming from Anselm, without this being directed to some creatures? Surely God does not exercise providence over himself or feel compassion for himself. To respond to this query, we must further specify how we should construe these perfections. In the first place, note that some of them could be realized even if God were alone in reality. He could still have perfect knowledge of himself. Could the knowledge be perfect if there were no knowledge of anything else? Of course. Perfect knowledge is knowing everything that there is to know. So if nothing else exists, the lack of knowledge of what doesn't exist would be no defect. And God's felicity and glory could be without limit even if there were no creation. And finally, the love between the persons of the Trinity could be infinite, apart from any relations to creation. But you say it's got to be a different story for goodness, power, compassion, and providentiality. These could not be exercised, indeed, without creatures on which to do so. I've already noted this for compassion and providentiality, and the same holds for goodness and power. Within the Trinity, there's no place for an exercise of power, because there's nothing to change. Everything is already perfect. And for the same reason, there's no need to perform any good actions or bestow value on anything. Nevertheless, we can in fact construe these perfections so as to attribute them to God as he is in himself. And the way to do that is to think of them as tendencies or dispositions rather than the actualizations thereof. Think, for example, of the divine perfection of providentiality or compassion as God's being disposed to act lovingly or compassionately should the occasion to do so arise. Now, God could be so disposed even if no creatures were ever produced to provide such an occasion. So this is a crucial aspect in which God's activity vis-a-vis creatures reflects what he is in himself, namely that would be his disposition. So there is a good case for the strict truth of attributions of some perfection characteristics to God. But that only gets us as far as generic theism. How about something more distinctively Christian? Well, one central Christian doctrine is the incarnation of God in Jesus Christ. But this is out of bounds for the present stage of the argument for the simple reason that that has to do with God's connection with creation. Because the incarnation involves God becoming incarnate in human form. And apart from the human part of creation, the Christian sort of incarnation could never have happened. It's not a fact concerning God as he still would be if he had remained alone in reality. But we needn't look far to find a central Christian doctrine that really does deal with God as he is in himself, and that's the Trinity. According to the Christian tradition, God would exist as three persons bound together in a maximally loving and intimate communion while remaining one God, even if God never brought into being anything other than himself. Just how this is possible is recognized on almost all sides as a mystery. In Lecture 1, I used the Trinity as a prime example of a mystery in this sense, that we don't understand how it's possible, in contrast to the kind of mystery of the divine mystery thesis, which is about concepts not applying to God. In saying that these kinds of mystery are contrasted, I simply pointed to their difference. I'm not saying that they're mutually exclusive. On the contrary, the Trinity in particular is a prime example, perhaps, of both kinds of mystery. We can't understand how it's possible, and maybe the concepts don't apply. I've just been pointing out that it's plausibly regarded as a mystery of the lack of adequate understanding sort. And since it concerns God as he is in himself, it will be regarded by advocates of the divine mystery thesis as also a mystery in that sense. But as for that point, whether the divine mystery thesis holds for Trinity, look, we're now focusing on the opposed view, the antithesis view, that it is an example of a doctrine about God as he is in himself that involves strictly true applications of concepts to God. And certainly a good case can be made for that if the doctrine of the Trinity is to be viable at all. There are controversies over just how person is to be understood in the doctrine. But look, however we understand person, so long as there are three divine persons, they differ from each other. And this comes out in the way the persons are given different roles in the inner nature of God. The Father is the ultimate source of the other two, begetting the Son, from whom, together with the Father, according to the Western Church, the Holy Spirit proceeds. Now, however we understand begetting and proceeding, if they have any meaning we can grasp at all, in accepting the doctrine of the Trinity, we are committed to applying concepts of begetting to the Father, being begotten to the Son, and proceeding from the Father and the Son to the Spirit. And so, despite being a mystery that is unlikely ever to be dissipated, understood, it is not, so it appears, a mystery in the divine mystery thesis sense. We are applying concepts. So, at the heart of the Christian faith, we seem to have an aspect of what God is in himself to which the divine mystery thesis doesn't apply. In addition to specific doctrines that have a strong claim within Christianity to involve strictly true applications of concepts to God as he is in himself, there are some general considerations that should move partisans of the divine mystery thesis to worry about such possibilities. The basic point is this: are the contemplative experiences that support the divine mystery thesis connected with one's life outside those experiences, or are they not? If they're not connected, then the purported experiential encounter with the mysterious God is not important for the Christian life generally, and is, to put it cruelly, merely a way of feeling very, very good from time to time. But this alternative is not taken seriously by any of the major contemplatives, including our two Trappist guides. On the contrary, they insist that the main point of contemplation lies in its fruits for life generally, the transformation of the person and every aspect of her life as a result of union with God. Well, how is that point connected with our present concerns? This way. By virtue of the fact that one cannot bring the mysterious inner nature of God into an effective bearing on one's daily life without applying some concepts to God. Though this is sufficiently obvious, one might think that the concept applications are restricted to God and his interactions with creation. And many of them are. Speaking of God as present within all of us all the time, as working to transform us into the person he would have us be, and as Keating likes to say, acting as the divine psychotherapist, are obvious examples of pointing out a relation of God to us. But it is either difficult or impossible to connect all this from God as God is in himself. Such salvific actions as those just mentioned must stem from such intrinsic characteristics of God in himself, as being loving, compassionate, self-giving. And so even the mystic is driven by powerful considerations concerning the relevance of the experience to life, despite his advocacy of the divine mystery thesis, to recognize conceptual knowledge of God as he is in himself, and thereby to take seriously the antithesis of his own thesis. Well, I think this makes, for these purposes, a sufficient case for there being attributions to God as he is in himself, both of a generic theistic variety and of a distinctively Christian cast, that the Christian tradition is committed to regarding as strictly true the applications of some concepts to God, concepts that are available to at least some of us human beings. And that's enough to give us our antithesis and enable us now to push on to the task of synthesis. I'm going to work up to my way of pulling the rabbit out of the hat by examining two other attempts in the literature that I take to be objectionable in one way or another. Since they don't arrive at their distinctive views on talk and thought about God in just the way that I've arrived at this point in my triad, they don't exactly present their views as a solution to my problem. Even so, they're close enough to enable me to look at them as such. Now, before examining these positions and my own, here are some general remarks about the task of synthesis. The most important point to make is that we can't expect either the thesis or the antithesis to emerge unscathed from a synthesis. To achieve a synthesis, there has to be some give on each side. And one difference between responses to the problem is in how the balance gets struck. Which of the contenders is modified less, unless it should be that a perfect balance is struck. My first exhibit is Paul Tillich, and his view of almost all statements about God is symbolic. Tillich comes very close to my way of setting up the problem with an initial divine mystery thesis, and here he quotes Tillich. Since God is the ground of being, he is the ground of the structure of being. But he's not subject to this structure. The structure is grounded in him. The statement that God is being itself is a non-symbolic statement. It means what it says directly and properly. However, after this has been said, nothing else can be said about God, which is not symbolic. Therefore, if anything beyond this bare assertion is said about God, it no longer is a direct and proper statement, no longer a concept. It is indirect, and it points to something beyond itself. In a word, it is symbolic. That from Tillich's first volume. Thus, Tillich deviates from radical Mysterianism only to the extent of recognizing one strictly true application of a concept to God, namely the concept of being itself. With that exception noted, his version of the divine mystery thesis is even more radical than mine, for he makes no distinction between God as he is in himself and God in his relations to creation. All other statements about God are said to be symbolic, rather than involving applications of concepts. And just what does Tillich mean by symbolic? That's not easy to say. Many articles and books have wrestled with the topic. Here is what I take to be the best interpretation. It's misguided to ask whether religious doctrines tell it like it is with respect to God. Since God, being itself, is beyond any conceptualization, it's hopeless to seek any correspondence between what we say about God and God. Instead, our God talk is made up of symbols of God that point to his reality by participating in his power and being. But any literal correspondence of our religious beliefs or statements with the divine is simply out of the question. So Tillich's way of combining the divine mystery thesis with religiously significant talk about God is to construe the latter as entirely symbolic in the sense explained. Now, it's obvious that this particular synthesis is heavily tilted towards the thesis, the divine mystery thesis. Apart from the one exception, being itself, the divine mystery thesis is left intact, while the antithesis, with that one exception, is completely gutted. No other true applications of concepts to God are recognized. So this is a synthesis only in the most Pickwickian sense. It's more properly described as an almost complete capitulation by the antithesis. At least, that would be the verdict if Tillich had stuck to his guns. But that's not the case. We have to remember that Tillich is a self-described Christian theologian. And when he gets down to the business of theology as such, the tough, purely symbolic talk disappears. He sets himself to tell us what religious symbols really mean. What is being said of being itself in his version of Christian theology? Few samples. Quote, divine will and intellect are symbols for dynamics in all its manifestations and for form as the meaningful structure of being itself. Another passage. If we call God the living God, what we assert is that he is the eternal process in which separation is posited and overcome by reunion. Another passage. Providence is the divine condition which is present in every group of finite conditions, and in the totality of finite conditions, it is the quality of inner directedness in every situation. 3 explications of symbols. So if dynamics in all its manifestations, separation overcome by reunion, and inner directedness, if those 3 expressions don't express concepts, then I've lost touch with the English language. To be sure, applying these concepts to being itself, that is, what Tillich understands to be God, gives us something radically different from more traditional Christian theology. Nevertheless, these and many other quotations from Tillich's systematic theology constitute his version of how to talk truly and theologically about God. And they're bristling with the application of concepts to God. So when push comes to shove, Tillich is as much committed to my antithesis as the most traditional of theologians. It's just that he makes truth claims for the application of different concepts than traditional theologians to God. So how about John Hick? The point of departure for Hick's mature views on how to understand talk about God is the problem of religious diversity. And his main defense of those views is that they enable us to give an acceptable account of that diversity. This is different from the way that I've been setting up my problem in these lectures. But when Hick develops his view, it turns out to involve something very much like a divine mystery thesis, with respect to what he calls the ultimate, which is close enough to God as he is in himself to enable me to treat Hick as also seeking a way from my thesis and antithesis to live together. So here's how it all works out in Hick's case. The view of religious thought and talk at which Hick arrives is an application of Kant's position on the perceivable physical world. It's not Kant's account of religion. That's different. Just as Kant took our knowledge of the physical world to be restricted to phenomena, to the ways that reality appears to our senses, and not to penetrate to that reality itself, so Hick considers the objects of worship in a given religion, preeminently God in theistic religions, to have a phenomenal rather than a noumenal reality. Like Kant, he supposes there to be a noumenal ultimate reality, the real or the ultimate, and that appears to us in various ways. But again, like Kant, he denies that we can know anything substantive about the real or the ultimate, except for the ways that it appears to us. Few quotations here from Hick. None of the concrete descriptions that apply within the realm of human experience can apply literally to the unexperienceable ground of that realm. Our language can have no purchase on a postulated noumenal reality which is not even partly formed by human concepts. This lies outside the scope of our cognitive capacities. That's Hick's parallel, and a very close parallel indeed, to the divine mystery thesis. When Hick applies this Kant-based scheme to religion, the scheme becomes relativized. Instead of a single human schematism of the manifold of sensation by a unique set of categories, that's Kant, we have different interpretations of the real as it appears to people in different religious traditions. And this relativization of how the ultimate appears to you and your tradition reflects Hick's concern to deal with the problem of religious diversity. As in Kant's doctrine of the physical world, this position then is intermediate between unqualified realism about the ultimate and unqualified non-realism about it. The modes of appearance of the real in a given religion, including the Christian Trinity, are, to use Kant's terms, empirically real, but transcendentally ideal. They're objective vis-a-vis any particular individual, but their status is that of modes of appearance rather than an independent reality which is appearing. Now, the most important thing I want to say about this position is that it radically deviates from the way God and other objects of worship are standardly regarded in the religious traditions in question that Hick deals with. I'll confine this criticism to Christianity, but there will be parallel points about other traditions. The only thing in Hick's view that's acceptable to the traditional Christian understanding of God is that it portrays God as being as real as the physical world on a Kantian reading. We can interact with Hick's Christian God as genuinely as we can with trees, horses, houses, and human bodies, as these are construed by Kant. But this falls short of a Christian understanding, just because the latter, a Christian understanding, is firmly committed to regarding God as identical with the ultimate supreme reality, rather than as one way among others in which that ultimate reality appears to people. The Kantian story of the physical world is less of a jolt to ordinary common sense than Hick's story is to Christians, just because less hangs on the metaphysical status of the physical world. So long as the patterns of our sense experiences remain what they are, we can perhaps adjust to Kant's metaphysical downgrading of trees and houses to systems of phenomena. But I can't see that Christianity and other theistic religions can adjust to an analogous downgrading of God without becoming something radically different. God cannot be causa sui, that on which everything else depends for its being, the one who exercises providence over the whole creation, while consisting of a way in which something else appears. So whatever else may be said for Hick's position as a program for a radical revision of standard ways of construing religious belief, I fear that there's just nothing to be said for it as an account of religious belief, as it is almost universally regarded by believers. What remains is to see what kind of balance Hick's position strikes between my thesis and antithesis, and compare that with Tillich's. In Hick's case, unlike Tillich's, the situation is complicated by the fact that for a given religion, there are always two objects of worship to be considered, and it makes a difference to the synthesis which one of those you're talking about. Sticking with Christianity, there's both the ultimate and the system of the ways the real appears to the Christian community. If we focus on the former, the ultimate, then the thesis is preserved intact. Can't say anything about that. And the antithesis goes almost entirely by the board. But suppose we focus instead on ways the real appears. Since Hick is not specifically concerned with my problem, he doesn't address himself to how much the ways the real appears in a particular religious tradition can be conceptually characterized, and how much of it, if any, remains beyond concepts. But remember that my antithesis is a pretty modest one. It only claims that many strictly true propositions about how God is in himself can be formed by the application of concepts in the human repertoire. And so on this focus, we get the opposite verdict. The antithesis survives intact. We can say lots of things about how God appears, and the thesis is at least considerably modified. The only way Hick can make thesis and antithesis live together in harmony in Christianity without modifying either is by applying the thesis to the real and the antithesis to the ways that the real appears. But this works as a synthesis for Christians only if they are prepared to divide things up in this way between Hick's two Christian references. And we've seen that they're not. They're not prepared to accept a purely phenomenal entity as their object of worship and commitment, center of meaning for their lives, and so forth. On the contrary, they insist that God is the ultimate being, the source of being for everything else, the providential ruler of the universe, redeemer of those who turn to him, and so on. They are not prepared to settle for a phenomenal reality of as God as the price for reconciling conceptual knowledge of God with the divine mystery thesis. And so this plural reference for God, way of reconciling thesis and antithesis, will not work for Christianity or any other theistic religions. I now unveil a synthesis that not only avoids the defects of the two positions just discussed, but also satisfies any reasonable criteria for a successful way in which the two apparently irreconcilable antagonists can live together in harmony, with only minimal modifications of each. At least that's what I aim to do. Whether I succeed, I leave to your judgment. I'll start by chipping away on the antithesis side, seeking a way of making statements about God that are sufficiently intelligible and robust to give us what we need as guidance in our relations with God, and to express what we feel moved to accept and say about God. The need to make this compatible with a suitably weakened divine mystery thesis will be in the back of my mind and will come to the surface later. So a crucial point for this enterprise is that for the most part, the terms we use to speak of God are taken from our talk of creatures. Terms like purpose, plans, knowledge, love, command, forgive, and so on. Even if, as the stress on mystery implies, these terms are not strictly speaking true of God in just the same sense as that in which they are sometimes strictly speaking true of creatures, still it seems plausible that there must be some analogy between human and divine purposes, plans, commands, forgivenesses, and so forth. Else, why use those terms rather than others? The idea that talk of God is analogical has surfaced repeatedly in the Christian tradition and other traditions. But we must tread carefully here if we're not to lose the commitment to mystery. The crucial question is this: are we in a position to specify just how divine purpose, knowledge, and so forth is and is not similar to their human prototypes? If we were in such a position, then we'd be able to frame concepts that contain all and only the points of commonality between divine and human. And so once again, with those concepts, those new concepts, we'd be able to say things of God that are perfectly true of God. To give divine mystery its due, we must recognize that we cannot whittle away at the creaturely terms until they contain only a kernel of what is strictly speaking true of the divine. We can go some distance in that direction. We can remove from terms like command and forgive any implication that they involve the use of vocal cords. But the divine mystery thesis implies that even if we've done everything we can to spruce up terms for speech about God, what we say is still not strictly speaking true of God as it stands. Aquinas, quote, "There is in every name that we use an imperfection which does not befit God." So the only way to satisfy both the constraints under which we are working, both the constraints, is to use creaturely terms, purified as much as we can, in our thought and talk about God, while recognizing that they are not fully adequate to the task. Now that's really easy to say, but the question is how, given that less than complete adequacy, such talk can be still an appropriate guide for our lives. I'll be presenting my position, but I'm not without predecessors in this enterprise. And one Christian thinker I find very impressive on the subject is I.M. Crombie in 2 essays from the 50s. Crombie holds that, quote, "When we speak about God, the words we use are intended in their ordinary sense, although we do not suppose that in their ordinary interpretation they can be strictly true of him. We don't even know how much of them applies." End of the quotation. Thus, Crombie leaves us wondering how we can suppose that we're saying anything reasonably determinate about God. And here's his answer. Quote, Crombie, "The things we say about God are said on the authority of the words and acts of Christ, who spoke in human language using parable, and so we too speak of God in parable, authoritative parable, authorized parable, knowing that the truth is not literally that which our parables represent, trusting, because we trust the source of the parables, that in believing them and interpreting them in the light of each other, we shall not be misled, that we shall have such knowledge as we need to possess for the foundation of the religious life." End of the quote from Crombie. This is, of course, an expanded use of the word parable, in which anything we say of God, even anything so simple as God wants us to have loving communication with him, counts as a parable. Though the words do not strictly apply, we have the authority of Christ, God incarnate, for taking them to be close enough to the strict truth about God to be an adequate guide to our relations with God and our fellows. Note that this resolution of the problem holds at best only for those who accept the authority of Christ. It's an account of the kind of status these statements can have for those who recognize the kind of divine authority of which Crombie speaks. One who satisfies those conditions can have an assurance that what is being thought and said about God is close enough to the exact truth for our human condition, even though in that condition vaunting theoretical aspirations cannot be satisfied. But since the problem we're considering doesn't arise only for mainline Christians, it would be desirable to have a more generally applicable response. And indeed, I think that Crombie's idea can be turned into something that's not tied to so specific a Christian orientation, or indeed to any Christian orientation at all. The basic idea is this: where we're dealing with something we cannot cognitively grasp sufficiently to make statements that are strictly true of it, we may still manage something that's close enough to being strictly true to be a useful guide for our lives, and more specifically, for our interactions with the entity or entities in question. So far, maybe so good. But even if we're reconciled to this stance, we'd like to have more of a sense of how these not fully adequate ways of thinking and talking about something can still be an effective guide for our lives and for our interaction with that something. Here are some less puzzling examples of this sort of situation can be enlightening. I will present three for your consideration. I'm going to skip the second of the three that Alston gives. Here's one example to help us think about it. Let's think of a 3-year-old grandson of mine wanting to know what I do when I go to my office. Telling him I work doesn't completely satisfy his thirst for knowledge. So I tell him that I make things. Like we do with blocks at preschool, he asks. Well, not exactly, I say, but something like that. I don't build things with blocks or anything else you can hold in your hands, but I do make things. Let's assume that this satisfies a 3-year-old grandson for the moment. Is he in possession of an adequate conception of the intellectual work that is involved in making a piece of philosophical writing, or constructing an argument for a position, or analyzing a concept, or preparing notes for a class? Obviously not. His attention has been directed to an activity with which he is familiar, making things with blocks, and told that what I do is something like that. He's in no position to specify exactly how what I do is like making playhouses with blocks, though he's been told one way in which it's unlike. It's not made out of blocks. But at least he's come to realize that some kind of making is involved. I submit that this is a useful example of how one's grasp of a state of affairs can be less than zero, even though it radically fails to be an adequate grasp of that subject matter. The situation of my grandson here is something like the position we're all in with respect to God, according to my way of reconciling the antithesis with the divine mystery thesis. You may think that this example is not a sufficient analog for my approximate truth account of what we say about God as he is in himself. For unlike the latter, my grandson, you will say, does apply the concept of making something to me at my office with strict truth. In response, I deny that my grandson has any such concept that is strictly true of my activity. At least I can plausibly characterize him that way, because he's my fictitious grandson and I'm making him up the way I want to make him up. As I portray him, he has not reached the stage of cognitive development to form the abstract, very unspecific concept of bringing something into existence, where that concept is abstract enough to involve no specification of any particular way of doing so. He's capable only of more specific concepts, such as making mud pies, building things with blocks, and so forth. And so he's forced to use one or several such concepts as the closest he can get to grasping what I do at my office. And none of those concepts apply to what I do with strict truth, though they give him an imperfect grasp of that. And now let me skip to his third example. It is a fundamental feature of sense perception that sense experience is a joint function of the objects perceived and our ways of being perceptually affected by them. We can't neglect either of these factors. Obviously, the nature of the object makes some difference. Otherwise, everything we saw at a given moment would look just alike. But we make a contribution too. We are not perfectly clear windows that admit an unadulterated grasp of the objective realities perceived. One and the same object looks different from different perspectives, distances, and in different conditions of our perceptual apparatus. And the same object appears differently to perceivers with different perceptual faculties, and so forth. Moreover, from the 17th century on, thinkers have been impressed with the way our contribution to perceptual experience is such as to make it a not wholly reliable guide to what perceived objects are like in themselves. Modern physics has enforced a distinction among perceived qualities between primary qualities that attach to physical objects as they are in themselves, size, shape, motion, and secondary qualities that do not, at least as they appear to our do not apply, at least as they appear to our sensory experience. To take the most familiar example, our visual awareness of color presents it as something simple that is spread uniformly and continuously over the surface of visual objects. But with respect to a uniformly red disk, physical science recognizes no such quality of the disk itself. It depicts that object as made up of innumerable submicroscopic particles, none of themselves exhibiting phenomenal color, separated by lots of empty space. Moreover, phenomenal colors exhibit various interrelations. No, let me skip. Further bearings of this on our present concern come into view when we ask how to interpret ordinary attributions of color to perceived objects like that leaf is yellow. There are several candidates for how we should understand this. One, the most obvious and the most naive understanding is the one we've just seen to be rejected by physical science. To say that the leaf is yellow is to say that there's a color spread continuously over the leaf surface, a quality of just the sort in the objects that it visually appears to be. Call that naive understanding the phenomenal understanding. Two, some suggest that what we mean is that the leaf is such that in normal conditions of visual perception, it produces in human beings of a certain sort an appearance of phenomenal yellow. That avoids conflict with science, indeed, but at the cost of a considerable distance of this complicated property from the way the leaf visually appears. Call this the dispositional understanding. Or three, we could try to pin down that physical property that is responsible for the disposition to create a phenomenal appearance of yellow, and take the leaf as yellow to be attributing that physical property to the leaf. Now, I'm not going to attempt here to decide between these alternatives. I'm concerned only to set up an illuminating example of a not strictly speaking true way of thinking and talking about objects that is nonetheless of great practical utility in guiding our dealings with them. And for this purpose, one, the phenomenal construal, to call it yellow is to say that it's got this intrinsic color spread out. The phenomenal construal gives us just what we need. As we've just seen, thinking of the leaf as possessing yellowness, as it appears to us visually, has, for good and sufficient reason, been ruled out by the physicists as an accurate account of what the leaf is like in itself. But in spite of this, our visual discrimination of the colors of objects, taken neat, without fancy theoretical transformations, are of enormous value in guiding our dealings with those very objects. We get practically valuable information about the chemical nature of a solution by determining whether it turns a certain kind of paper from looking yellow to looking blue. What color a person's skin looks to be tells the physician something about that person's actual state of health. By seeing whether the grass looks brown or green, one is guided to water it or not. And so it goes in innumerable other cases. This is an excellent example of how a way of thinking and talking about a subject matter can be a valuable guide for our interactions with it, even while we acknowledge that it's not, strictly speaking, true. Okay, so let's return from the analogies to our central concern. Suppose that this approximation to truth position is the best way of reconciling what we think, accept, and say about God, as he is in himself, to the divine mystery thesis. How does it all work out in the application? Well, the first thing to note is that it need make no difference at all to the state of mind of the average Christian believer. It's not as if one who intends to make judgments or statements about what God is like in himself would have to accompany them always by a conscious acknowledgement that they are at best approximately true of God and so forth. The way a believer makes such statements may not differ at all from someone who takes them to be strictly true, or someone who takes some other route to a reconciliation. It's only when somebody engages in these higher level reflections on the status of what she's doing that the type of synthesis becomes explicit. And since most religious believers rarely, if ever, consider such second-level theoretical issues, they will usually proceed in blissful unawareness of what is the most acceptable resolution. They simply say or think or believe what they're inclined to and leave the meta-religious issues for philosophers. It would maybe be an overstatement, though, to say that these meta-religious issues make no difference to the average religious believer. Even if the average religious believer doesn't think about them on his or her own initiative, it can happen that views on these matters are presented to them in what they read or see on television. I'm not sure what kind of television Bill has in mind here, but or encounter in conversation, especially if they encounter a view like Hick's, which runs strongly counter to traditional ways of thinking, but also views like Tillich's, or even mine, which might also be a shock on first acquaintance. They may be drawn into thinking whether this account of religious thought, talk, or belief is something that can be accommodated by their habitual religious attitudes. And if they become convinced that, say, Hick's view cannot be accommodated, they may well be impelled to look around for a viable alternative that they can live with. And so it would be too much to say that these issues are of no significance whatsoever to religious believers who are innocent of launching philosophical investigations on their own. Other people may launch them for them. Be that as it may. It remains the case that it is the higher level issues that are my concern in these lectures. And so I must look at the question I raised for Hick's position and for Tillich's position, namely, just what kind of balance am I striking by my position between the thesis and the antithesis, and how is it related to Hick and Tillich on this point? Well, it might seem that my position leaves the thesis, no concepts apply to God in himself and so forth, truly apply, in complete possession of the field, without the need for any modification. For the divine mystery thesis, as I've been taking it, says that no concepts can be applied to God as he is in himself with complete truth. And since on my position anything we say of God as he is in himself is at best an approximation to truth, that's perfectly consistent, so it would seem, with the full force of the divine mystery thesis. So it appears. But things aren't quite as they appear. In order to have a clear-cut, precise target for my discussion throughout, I've tacitly watered down the divine mystery thesis from how it is expressed in my primary sources. Consider the following statements once again from my sources. God as he is in himself is, now some quotations, darkness to our minds, beyond the reach of anything our minds can understand, beyond words, thoughts, and emotions, beyond the half-light even of created images and concepts. End of the quotations. These formulations represent God as more mysterious to our intellects than is captured by my saying that no conceptual applications to him are strictly true. They take God as so mysterious that no attempt to use concepts to cognitively grasp God can have any success whatever. And that rules out even my approximately true concept applications, which I proposed in my version of a synthesis. So in fact, my synthesis does require a considerable weakening of the divine mystery thesis from how we find it in our sources. That weakening does not go so far as to rob the principle of all cutting edge. The weakened principle still denies strictly true applications of concepts to God as he is in himself. The divine mystery thesis expressed by our sources was stronger than that. It just said away with concepts. But this is far from being weak. And how does the antithesis fare? That we can say things true about God. It too does not escape unscathed. Whereas in my formulations it represented certain statements about God as he is in himself as strictly true, my proposed synthesis represents them as, at best, approximations to the truth. So in conclusion, we do have here a genuine compromise in which each side gives up something and also retains something. And this comes the closest of any of the positions I have considered to being an even balance. I don't claim that it's quite perfectly balanced. Maybe it's tilted more to the antithesis side, for it would seem that the approximate truth of conceptual applications to God, as he is in himself, is closer to the antithesis than what remains of the absolute mystery to the intellect, is to the thesis, as we found that in our sources. So, a brief summation. Let me sum up where I find myself at the end of this exploration. I gave reasons for taking seriously the divine mystery thesis, reasons from the mystical tradition, construed as the view that God, as he is in himself, in contrast to his relations to creation, is a mystery to the human intellect. Where that can be partially at least cast out is the view that we cannot form strictly true propositions about God, as he is in himself, by applying concepts from the human repertoire. That was the thesis. The reasons I emphasized had to do with the non-conceptual, mystical, experiential knowledge of God that is claimed by major figures in the Christian tradition of contemplative prayer. This knowledge, they say, is of the sort that God has of himself, available to humans, insofar as it is, only by virtue of God sharing that knowledge with us by granting a union with himself. But I also gave reasons for taking very seriously the idea that not only is it possible for us to make true conceptual statements about God as he is in himself, but also that it's crucial for the Christian life that we be able to do so. That was the antithesis. Faced with strong inclinations to accept both of these apparently incompatible positions, I sought a synthesis that would make it possible to have both, with, of course, certain modifications in the initial bald statements of each. Modifications that involve each party making concessions to the opposition without wholly losing the thrust of its initial claim. I critically examined two attempts to do this by Tillich and Hick and found serious defects in each, and I then put forward a third reconciliation that involves, on the antithesis side, a retreat from strictly true propositions to propositions that enjoy a close approximation to truth, and a corresponding concession by the thesis to allow this much qualification of his claim that God, as he is in himself, is a complete mystery to the human intellect. And I then suggested that this is the best we can do by way of satisfying all the competing considerations that I have adduced in these lectures. I hope that whatever you may think about my conclusions, I've at least given you some things to think about, and that along the way, I have communicated to you something of what I believe to be the importance of your thinking about them.
Bill Alston is going to start by addressing us through the machine. Bill, this is John Hare. Yes, question 1. God, it is said, is the source of all that is other than God. How is it possible for any experience of the sort referred to in Lecture 2 to be an experience of God as so defined or thought of? If it is not possible, then how can the sort of experience in question be an experience of God or be plausibly construed as an experience of God?
Okay, I got that. Now, shall I answer that now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, before I start answering these questions, I want to express my thanks to you people that are involved in this for undertaking such an unusual procedure and such a burdensome procedure. I also want to make a general point before I start answering the individual questions, and that is that due to the fact that I have these lectures organized as an Hegelian triad, or at least my version of an Hegelian triad, and as a result, the final account of what I'm saying here doesn't come out fully until the end, until the third lecture, where we get the synthesis that's designed to explain how you can have the thesis, the divine mystery thesis, suitably qualified, and also recognize that human concepts can be applied to God. There has to be some give and take on both sides to get a synthesis, as I am attempting this, and as a result, things that look impossible or contradictory or what have you in the earlier lectures are supposed to be explained. Okay, that's a general point. Now, with respect to the first question, apart from that general point, I don't see any problem about how it's possible for there to be an exception. Since I'm formulating the thing, if I want to formulate it in such a way that there is an exception to the formulation I started with, that's presumably my right, because I'm the one that's setting it up. And also, there's the general point that you have to wait till the end to see how various things that I say are possible. Okay, that's it on the first question.
Number 2, the mystery thesis, as this listener understands it, is this: that no positive concepts can be truly applied to God as God is in God's self, except those minimally required in order to refer to God. 1. How to account for the possibility of such an exception. 2. Suppose such a concept, C, that is, one minimally required in order to refer to God. If, to start with, the mystery thesis, minus the exception, is true, it would seem that no such C can be truly applied to God. Does this not leave us with the conclusion that it's vain to suppose we can ever refer to God?
Yes, well, my general point applies in spades to this. In order to see why I think that this concept can be truly applied to God, suitably understood, you have to wait till we get to the synthesis in the third lecture as the final word of that on that, and in particular at I'll save that for the third question. But even apart from that point about waiting until the synthesis to see what the final word is, I should have made this formulation read no except those minimally required, if any, in order to refer to God, because I didn't intend the formulation to assert or presuppose that there are any concepts that are minimally required to be truly applied to God in order to refer to God. I wanted to leave that open, and I should have formulated it in such a way as to make that clear, which I didn't. But the larger point here is that you say if the mystery thesis minus the exception is true, it would seem that no such concept can be truly applied to God. Well, of course, the mystery thesis minus the exception isn't the mystery thesis that I was formulating and I was setting forth even in the second lecture before we get to the synthesis in the third lecture. The whole point of the exceptions is to formulate the mystery thesis so as to be conducive to its being synthesized eventually with the antithesis that it is possible to apply such concepts to God. So when you say minus the exception, that changes the game.
Thank you. This is question 3 from Kenyon Bratt. If no positive human concept can be said to apply to God as he is in himself, how can you apply the human concept, God as he is in himself, to God? And how can you suggest implicitly that you, in speaking of God as he is in himself, actually are saying anything, not least of all anything of God?
Yes, well, here too we have my general point that you have to wait for the synthesis in Lecture 3 to get the full story here, and that's directly relevant to how you can apply that human concept or any other to God as he is in himself. But we also have the point more specifically about how can I, speaking of God as he is in himself, given what I've been saying, actually saying anything at God. That is explicitly discussed at the end of the second lecture, where I say there's a multifaceted answer to that. It partly has to do with phenomenal characteristics of the experience, and it partly has to do with the route by which the subject reaches that experience. Of course, all that, again, is subject to the objection that, well, I've cut off the possibility of saying anything about God. And again, you have to wait the synthesis in Lecture 3 to get the answer to that, insofar as I've given any.
Okay. The question 4 is from me. Is the notion of analogy any help here in understanding how concepts both can and cannot be applied to God in God's self?
Well, that, of course, depends on how we understand the notion of analogy as both how, well, if we've got Aquinas in the background here who comes in explicitly in the next question, well, I'll leave Aquinas out for the moment. But, of course, this depends on how we're thinking of analogy. And the basic point in the way I'm bringing it in at this stage of the discussion is that although there has to be some analogy between, say, human forgiveness and divine forgiveness in order that the concept can intelligibly be applied to God in the face of the mystery thesis, my notion of that is such, my notion of analogy there is such that although we are committed to there being an analogy, it's not possible for us to spell out exactly what the points of analogy are. If we were, we would be losing the commitment to mystery that I take to be essential, especially at the stage of the dialectic in lecture 2. But even at the end, I take that to be a part of a whole picture.
Good. The last one is from Professor Wolterstorff. How, at the end of the day, does your position differ from your interpretation of Aquinas on analogy?
Well, I'm sure Nick will anticipate my answer to this. It all depends how you interpret Aquinas on analogy. Well, it all depends on how you interpret Aquinas on analogy and how you interpret me on analogy. I've just talked about the former. And of course, I'm more of an expert on how to interpret me than I am on how to interpret Aquinas. But I still have some pretensions of being a Thomistic scholar on points like this. So the more direct answer to the question is that my position at the end of the day, when we get to the last stage of the dialectic, is very similar to my understanding of Aquinas's in the analogy part, but that's really only part of it. There are also other features of it that stress mystery more, that are due to the pressure from the thesis, from the mystery thesis, in arriving at the complete picture of the synthesis as I present it.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to end the session now, and it's been good to hear your voice.
Well, thank you and all the other people who have been participating in this, and I realize that it's an unusual procedure and that it's difficult and even burdensome, and I greatly appreciate your doing so, your cooperating.
Nick says to you that we're sorry that you couldn't hear our applause of you.
Okay.